There's a moment most people never think about until it starts happening to them. You sit on the edge of the bed, you take a breath, and before you stand, some quiet part of your brain runs a calculation. Is this going to hurt today? Will my knee hold? Do I need to brace against something first? If that sounds familiar, you're not imagining it, and you're not simply getting old in the vague, unfixable way that phrase implies. Something far more specific is happening inside your body. And once you understand exactly what it is, you gain something most people never get with this problem, an actual way to reverse it, rather than just manage it. Let's try something together right now, wherever you happen to be sitting. Scoot slightly forward in your chair. Keep your back straight, feet flat on the floor, shoulders relaxed. Now lift your right leg, straighten it out in front of you, and hold it there for a full 5 seconds. Don't rush past this, actually notice what happens. Does the muscle along the top of your thigh begin to tremble slightly? Does the effort feel like it's coming from the wrong place, maybe migrating into the knee joint instead of staying in the muscle where it belongs? Does your thigh feel oddly heavy, almost disconnected, like it's a limb you're operating from a distance rather than one that simply obeys? That small tremor, that strange sense of distance, is not weakness in the way most people assume. It's a signal, a very specific, very informative signal. And by the end of this, you'll understand precisely what it's telling you and what to do about it. Here is the belief almost everyone carries into their 60s, quietly, without ever examining it, that stiff knees, heavy legs, and morning aches are simply the cost of time passing. Wear and tear, an inevitable bill finally coming due after decades of use. It's a comforting story in its own way because it removes responsibility and removes hope in the same breath. If it's just agging, there's nothing to be done, so why interrogate it further? But that explanation, however emotionally convenient, doesn't actually match what movement science shows us. The real story is stranger, more mechanical, and in some ways far more hopeful, because it means a significant portion of what you're feeling is not fixed. It's reversible, which raises an obvious question: if it isn't simply time wearing your body down, what is it? Think about the relationship between your brain and your leg muscles as a communication line, something like an old telephone cable running underground, connecting a control center to a distant outpost. In your 20s and 30s, that line carries a clean, immediate signal. Your brain says stand, and the message arrives instantly, fully intact, with no static and no delay. But communication lines that go unused for long enough begin to degrade. Insulation wears thin. Signals that once traveled instantly start to arrive faint, delayed, or distorted. And for most adults past 50, a very particular category of movement has quietly disappeared from daily life. Not exercise in the broad sense, but specific, functional movements that keep this neural wiring sharp and responsive. Deep sitting and rising, the kind where your hips travel well below knee height. Controlled, unhurried steps down an uneven slope or a curb, where your body has to negotiate changing ground in real time. Standing on one leg just long enough to put on a shoe or step into pants. These are the small, unglamorous transactions between brain and muscle that modern convenience has slowly engineered out of existence. Elevators replace stairs. Cars replace walking. Recliners and high-armed chairs do half the standing up work for you, so your legs never have to fully finish the job. Each convenience, taken alone, seems harmless, even sensible. But stacked across years, they add up to a body that has simply stopped practicing the exact movements that keep this internal wiring active. And wiring that isn't used in any system, biological or otherwise, tends to weaken. This distinction matters more than most people realize, because muscle strength and muscle communication are not the same thing, even though we tend to talk about them as if they were interchangeable. Research into agging and neuromuscular function has repeatedly shown that older adults can experience a striking decline in usable leg strength, sometimes losing a substantial share of their functional power, even in cases where the muscle tissue itself remains largely intact under a scan or a biopsy. The tissue is there, the architecture hasn't vanished. What's missing, in a meaningful number of cases, is the brain's reliable ability to recruit that tissue on command, quickly and completely, the moment it's needed. This is sometimes described in the research literature as a neuromuscular disconnect, and once you sit with that idea for a moment, it reframes the entire problem in a genuinely useful way. This isn't a muscle that has quietly withered away, gone for good, like a plant left without water for too long. It's a muscle waiting to be spoken to correctly again, present, capable, simply unaddressed. And that reframe changes everything about what the right solution looks like, which is worth pausing on, because the conventional wisdom here is not just unhelpful, it can actively backfire. The instinct, for well-meaning trainers, for adult children worried about a parent's mobility, even for the person experiencing this themselves, is often to push harder, heavier squats, more resistance. Grinding through discomfort, because that's simply what strength training is supposed to feel like. The no pain, no gain logic absorbed from decades of generic fitness culture. But a body that has spent 60+ years accumulating small amounts of cartilage wear, old joint strain, minor past injuries, and years of compensatory movement patterns does not respond well to brute force applied too early. Loading a compromised knee with heavy resistance before you've restored the underlying communication is a bit like revving an engine before checking whether all the wiring is properly connected. You might get some output, some noise, some motion, but you also risk real damage, and you very often end up reinforcing the exact faulty movement patterns you're trying to correct, just under heavier load. So what actually works? Something gentler, more precise, and honestly, more interesting than anything you'll typically find in a standard gym program built for a 25-year-old body. The goal here isn't to overpower your body into submission. It's to send it very specific, very clear, very deliberate signals, repeated consistently, until the old wiring reactivates on its own terms, at its own pace. We can organize this rebuilding process around 3 interconnected zones of the lower body. Each one quietly undermines the others when neglected. Which means weakness rarely stays contained to a single joint. It spreads, compensates, and shows up somewhere else entirely. And each zone needs a slightly different kind of attention to bring back online. Let's start with the zone people almost never suspect as the actual source of their pain, the outer hip. Most people who complain of knee pain assume, reasonably enough, that the problem lives in the knee. It's the joint that hurts after all, but very often, the knee is simply the messenger, not the source of the message. There's a muscle on the outer side of your hip called the gluteus medius, and its job is deceptively important. It acts almost like a steering mechanism, quietly keeping your knee tracking straight and stable every single time you take a step. When this muscle goes quiet, and it does go quiet remarkably easily with disuse, your knee begins to drift slightly inward with each stride you take. It's a small deviation, a matter of just a few degrees, completely invisible to the naked eye, invisible even to the person experiencing it. But repeated across thousands of steps a day, day after day, year after year, that tiny misalignment compounds into a persistent source of friction, irritation, and inflammation deep inside the joint itself. The knee, in effect, takes the blame and absorbs the damage for a problem that actually started several inches away, at the hip. The fix here doesn't require standing, balancing, or risking a fall, which matters enormously for anyone who already feels unsteady. Sit near the edge of a sturdy chair, loop a light resistance band just above your knees, and press your knees outward against the tension, holding that outward position for a full 2 seconds before slowly, deliberately allowing them to return to center. The word slowly matters here more than it might sound like it should. We'll come back to exactly why in a moment, because it turns out to be the single most important detail in this entire approach. Paired with this hip work, a simple movement for your calves and ankles closes the loop on overall lower body stability. Standing near a wall or sturdy countertop for balance, place the balls of your feet on a thick book or a low step. Let your heels drop just slightly below the edge until you feel a gentle stretch. Then rise slowly onto your toes and lower back down with control. This particular motion wakes up the connection between your ankle and your nervous system, the very same connection responsible for keeping you steady on uneven pavement, a slightly tilted sidewalk, or that one loose floorboard you've learned to step around without quite remembering why you started avoiding it. Now we move to the second zone, and this one carries a particular kind of quiet, everyday tragedy that rarely gets named directly. The back of your body, your glutes, your hamstrings, is architecturally built to be the powerhouse behind nearly every significant movement you make. Standing from a seated position, climbing stairs, lifting something up off the floor, even walking uphill. But decades of sitting, whether at a desk for work, behind a wheel while commuting, or sunk into a comfortable recliner each evening, gradually put these large, powerful muscles to sleep. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but functionally in terms of day-to-day recruitment. And when the strongest muscles in your entire body go quiet like this, something else has to pick up the workload they've abandoned. Almost always, that burden shifts onto your lower back and your knees, structures that were never designed or intended to carry this kind of heavy lifting duty on a daily basis. This shift is very often the hidden, unspoken reason behind that nagging lower back ache after an afternoon of gardening, or the sharp strain you feel the moment you bend down to lift a grandchild off the ground. Waking this entire system back up starts with something that feels almost meditative in its simplicity. Lying flat on your back, feet resting on a low, stable surface like a step stool or a firm couch cushion, pressing evenly through your heels to lift your hips slowly toward the ceiling, until your body forms one long, straight line running from your shoulders down through your hips to your knees. Hold briefly at the very top of the movement, gently squeezing the muscles of your backside, then lower yourself back down with the same slow control you used to rise. There's no impact here, no jarring, no compression traveling down through the spine, just a direct, unmistakable signal being sent to muscles that have sat in silence for years, sometimes decades. From there, a modified hip hinge, performed beside a sturdy table or countertop for support, teaches your body how to coordinate this newly reawakened strength with the ordinary bending and reaching movements that fill an average day, tying a shoe, retrieving something from a low shelf, picking a dropped item up off the floor. The kinds of small, automatic moments that used to require absolutely no conscious thought at all, before they quietly started to. Which brings us to the final zone, arguably the most important of the three, because it directly restores your ability to do the exact thing you likely came here worried about in the first place. Standing up, sitting down, and controlling your own body weight through space without hesitation, without a mental calculation first, without that quiet moment of dread on the edge of the bed. This is where a concept called eccentric loading becomes almost quietly revolutionary, and it's worth understanding not just what it is, but why it works the way it does. Most exercise, and honestly most of daily life, focuses heavily on the concentric phase of movement, pushing up, lifting, standing, the effortful part that we naturally think of as the exercise. But the eccentric phase, the slow lowering, the controlled descent against the pull of gravity, engages a different and often significantly underused portion of the nervous system. When you lower your body slowly rather than simply dropping into a chair or letting gravity do the work, your brain is forced to recruit muscle fibers it doesn't typically need to call upon during ordinary, fast movement. It's a bit like the difference between skimming a page of text and reading it carefully, word by word. The slow version demands your full attention in a way the fast version simply doesn't, and that heightened attention is precisely what rebuilds the connection between brain and muscle. To train this directly, find a very low, stable step. Even the bottom stair of a staircase in your home works perfectly well for this. Shift your entire body weight onto one leg and lower your other foot toward the ground as slowly as you can possibly manage, aiming for a full count of 3 to 5 seconds before your foot finally, softly touches down. There's no need to rush any part of this. The slowness isn't a modification for beginners. It is the entire mechanism, the whole point of the exercise. It forces your thigh and hip to act as living shock absorbers, firing continuously and steadily throughout the descent rather than in a single quick, reflexive burst the way they might during a fast, uncontrolled movement. Finish this sequence with something deceptively simple in appearance. Pick up 2 evenly weighted objects, a pair of light dumbbells, or even just 2 full water bottles from your kitchen. Stand tall with your shoulders drawn gently back, and walk a straight line down a hallway with deliberate, unhurried steps. This movement, often referred to as a farmer's carry, functions almost like a full-body exam. It quietly asks your core, your hips, your ankles, and your overall posture to work together simultaneously, mirroring almost exactly what your body needs to do the next time you're carrying groceries in from the car or a laundry basket up a flight of stairs. It's worth pausing here to really appreciate why the slow, deliberate nature of these movements matters so much more than raw intensity ever could. Fast, forceful exercise tends to recruit what might be described as the path of least resistance within your nervous system. The muscle fibers that are already accustomed to firing, already well connected, already doing most of the work by habit. Slow, controlled movement performed under lighter load does something meaningfully different. It essentially forces the nervous system to go searching for reinforcements, actively waking dormant fibers that fast, ballistic movement simply skips over entirely without ever engaging them. In that sense, slowness here isn't a compromise, a concession, or a beginner's simplified version of the real exercise. It is the mechanism itself, the active ingredient doing the actual work. A realistic approach to all of this means giving your body genuine time to adapt, rather than expecting some kind of overnight transformation that simply isn't how neuromuscular retraining works. 3 sessions a week is generally enough to begin meaningfully rebuilding this signal over time. In the first week, the priority should be simply control, moving with full intention and attention without adding any extra weight or resistance at all. By the second week, try holding the more challenging positions a second or two longer than feels entirely comfortable, gently expanding your capacity. By the third week, assuming things are feeling steady and controlled, a very light amount of added weight can begin to deepen the overall effect. This is deliberately not a race, and treating it like one tends to backfire in a very specific way. It tends to push people right back toward the same fast, compensatory movement patterns that caused the original problem, just now dressed up as progress. 2 small daily habits, requiring no extra time carved out of your day, can meaningfully amplify everything covered so far. The first concerns how your foot actually meets the ground each time you walk, consciously landing on your heel first, then rolling smoothly through the middle of your foot to push off from your toes at the end of each step. It sounds almost too simple to genuinely matter, but this single adjustment recruits the correct chain of muscles with every step you take throughout the day, quietly turning ordinary walking into a form of continuous, low-level rehabilitation happening in the background of your life. The second habit is about breaking a pattern rather than building a new one, specifically, the instinct to rock your torso backward and then forward to generate momentum when rising up out of a low or particularly deep chair. That rocking motion is very often a telltale sign that the legs have quietly outsourced their job to momentum and gravity instead of doing the lifting themselves. Instead, try planting both feet firmly on the ground, leaning your chest slightly forward over your knees, and directly asking your legs to perform the lifting work they were originally built to do. It may genuinely feel harder at first, noticeably so, but that increased difficulty is not a sign of failure or a step backward. It is the precise, unmistakable signal that the right muscles are finally being asked to work again after a long period of being quietly excused from the task. There's also a psychological dimension to all of this worth naming honestly, because the physical retraining doesn't happen in a vacuum. Many people who experience this kind of gradual mobility decline also experience a quiet, creeping anxiety around movement itself, a hesitation before stairs, a subtle avoidance of uneven ground, an unconscious narrowing of what feels safe to attempt. This isn't a character flaw or excessive caution. It's a rational response to a body that has, in fact, become less predictable and less reliable in its footing. But that avoidance, understandable as it is, tends to accelerate the very decline it's trying to protect against, because avoided movement is unpracticed movement, and unpracticed movement is exactly the kind of signal degradation we've been describing all along. Rebuilding physical confidence and rebuilding neuromuscular connection often need to happen together, each reinforcing the other, rather than waiting for one to fully resolve before addressing the second. What makes this entire approach different from the generic advice you've probably encountered before isn't complexity. If anything, it's strikingly simple in its individual components. What sets it apart is precision, Nothing described here demands a gym membership, specialized equipment, or a tolerance for real pain. What it demands instead is attention, noticing the tremor in your thigh during that opening test, noticing precisely which muscle fires first when you stand up from a chair, noticing the meaningful difference between rushing through a movement on autopilot and truly, deliberately feeling it happen. That noticing is not a small or incidental thing. It is, in a very real sense, the beginning of a conversation between your brain and your body that, for many people, went quiet years ago without anyone ever formally announcing that it was happening or that it could be reopened. If you tried that 5-second leg raise at the very start of this, you now understand exactly what that small, telling tremor was communicating to you, and more importantly, you have a genuine, structured way to respond to it, starting today rather than someday. The goal here was never to chase the raw strength of your 20s or 30s, an unrealistic and ultimately unnecessary target. The goal was to reopen a line of communication that time itself didn't actually erase. It only allowed to go quiet through disuse. And lines that have gone quiet, as it turns out, can be reopened, one deliberate, unhurried movement at a time.